Me, you're on 94.9. It is at 4:15. We've got Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International, and he's here to answer your questions. Talk about what's happened in the news over the last few weeks, anything to do with creation, evolution, dinosaurs, aliens, all those sorts of things. If you have any questions, we'd love you to get through to us. Just send a text message to 0401 949 949. Good afternoon, Dr. John.
Good afternoon, Mick.
It's great to have you back in here again. Of course, last week we had Dr. Taz Walker. Did you tune in?
Oh, I certainly did. And look, they really were a couple of great sessions the last 2 weeks. Taz is very easy to listen to. He knows what he's talking about, and he emphasises what we're constantly on about at Creation Ministries, and that is the truth of the Word of God. And it really doesn't matter whether the Bible's talking history or geography or any other topic. The Bible is true. And, I mean, people do, and Taz emphasised the age of the earth, the 6,000-year-old young earth, and people find it very hard to get their head around that. But the only reason it seems amazing to modern ears is because we've been constantly brainwashed about the millions and billions of years.
We've been brainwashed because we've heard it a lot. But then Dr. Taz mentioned stuff like, the $20 billion of silt and runoff that's eroded from the land every year that goes into the ocean, 20 billion tonnes. And my question to him was, well, where does it go? Can we see evidence of that on the ocean floor? And the answer is no. So, what we can see backs up the Bible.
Absolutely. This is where somebody like Taz, who's got a lot of the evidences at his fingertips, it's so important to listen to people like that. And, the Bible does say the earth is 6,000 years old, and there's just no argument. That's what it says. And oddly enough, the earliest and greatest scientists like Isaac Newton and his contemporaries, they didn't have any problem with that. It's only after Darwin and maybe in the last 150 years that we've had this constant billions and billions of years trumpeted all over the place. And we hear it so often that people assume that it's true and been proven. But of course, it hasn't. And there's plenty of evidence supporting the young earth, as Taz mentioned last week. And not that from a Christian point of view, we look at evidence to support our belief. We believe it anyway. But it does help to be able to put forward supporting evidence when you're talking to somebody who really has a few doubts. And 1 Peter 3:15 tells us to always be ready to give a reason for the hope that's within us, but to do it courteously. But we really shouldn't need to do that with fellow Christians because they've got exactly the same Bible and they ought to be believing it because that's what it says. And there were a couple of very interesting articles on the Creation Ministries website recently about supposed inaccuracies and contradictions in the Bible. And of course, people have been pointing out these things for a long time, but they always seem to get resolved in favour of biblical accuracy. The Bible is true after all. And I read a fascinating article about one of them in relation to a verse in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 2:17. Now, Matthew was talking about the slaughter of the little boys in Bethlehem by Herod. We all remember the story. He inquired from the wise men when the star had first appeared, and then he worked out that if he killed off all the little boys of 2 years old and under, then he'd probably get Jesus, which of course he didn't do. But Matthew says that slaughter fulfilled a prophecy in Jeremiah. Now, when you look at the Bible, in fact, the prophecy doesn't come direct from Jeremiah, it comes from Zechariah. And on the face of it, it looks like Matthew made a mistake. But a Christian theologian mentioned that he had done his PhD at a Jewish university in the US. And the lecturer, who was Jewish, said that the Jews used to link the prophetic books in groups. And Jeremiah was the lead book in one of those groups.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jewish custom, if they were quoting from any of the books in that group, they usually said it came from the lead book, right? So Matthew was writing for a Jewish audience, and he did exactly what they would have expected him to do. He said the verse came from the lead book in the group, Jeremiah, because that was their custom.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even though it actually was in Zechariah. So Matthew didn't make a mistake. He did exactly what his culture and custom would have expected him to do.
Mm-hmm.
And for centuries, critics would have claimed that he was wrong, but in fact, he was right according to custom all along. And it was the critics that were wrong, because they didn't understand first century Jewish culture and custom.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
There's what looks like a mistake, but it isn't a mistake because it's following the custom.
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, look, that brings me to a question that we had the last time I was on the program, Mick, and I said I'd talk about it today.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the issue of Israel.
Yep.
And our listener wrote in and said, you know, there's all this stuff going on in Israel at the moment, and
Yep.
he asked a question whether they're the same Israelites then as they are now, and so on.
Yep.
And it really is very, very interesting what's going on, and it's absolutely essential that we understand the history of the place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I suppose the first point that needs to be made is that historically, the area that we now call Palestine was originally called Israel, and that name was actually given by God to Abraham's grandson Jacob.
Yep.
God changed his name to Jacob. We read the story in Genesis where he wrestled with the angel all night, and in the morning God says, okay, from now on you're going to be called Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So God invented the name, and the land got named after Jacob, who was Abraham's grandson. And God said that he gave it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants as an everlasting possession. Mm-hmm. Now, everlasting to me means everlasting. Mm. So, you know, I think we have to say that it still is their land.
Yep.
Now, God did tell Abraham that they'd lose it for a while and then get it back again. Mm. And, of course, that happened because Jacob and his extended family went down into Egypt, and when the Egyptian rulership changed, they became slaves, and God delivered them under Moses. And under Joshua's leadership, they reclaimed the land by conquest, and that's where they stayed. Jerusalem was the capital under David and Solomon. Solomon built the temple there, and despite plenty of hiccups and being conquered by the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and so on, the Jews stayed in Israel with Jerusalem as the capital. And that's where they were in Jesus' day. That's where the second temple was, and that's where Jesus was crucified and resurrected, and it's where Pentecost occurred. So there is no doubt that that land, Israel, with the capital, Jerusalem, was the land of the Jewish people. There's simply
part of the question was, is the Israel we're talking about today the Israel before Christ?
Right. Well, it's not as extensive in area by any means, and it's nowhere near as extensive as the amount of land that God actually gave to Abraham. because he gave them land extending right from the Mediterranean Sea to the Euphrates River, which obviously is much, much more than they have at the moment. But where they are was certainly part of that land that God gave to Abraham.
Yep.
So yes, in that sense, although it's diminished in size, it is the same land. And the Jews have been in Jerusalem and Israel from huge antiquity. I mean, it's got to go back more than 3,500 years. But when the sack of Jerusalem occurred in 70 AD under the Romans, and they got dispersed, after that they were dispersed all over the world. Now, obviously, some Jewish people stayed there, but the rest of them just went all over the world, as they are now.
Yes.
And it's only in recent times that so many of them have been flooding back into Israel.
Yep.
But we'll continue that when we come back.
You're on 94.9. It is 26 minutes past 4. Good. That was Tasha Layton. Look what you've done. You're on 94.9. It's 23 minutes to 5, and we have Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. He's been answering a question that Kevin sent through a few weeks ago in regards to Israel. Kevin was asking about, he's been interested in Israel ever since this conflict that's been happening. And the question was, is the Israel today, the one that we're, talking about, the same Israel that was there before Christ? And, maybe tell us about the Israelites as well. And you've been giving us a bit of a history lesson, Dr. John.
Yes, Mick, it really is a very, very interesting place. And, of course, in the time of Jesus, it was known as Israel, all right, but the Jews never really ran the place. They were still subservient to the foreign power, and of course, in Jesus' day, it was Rome. And we know in the book of Esther, it was the Persians who were in charge, and of course, then the Greeks were in charge. And then the Romans, and of course there was always a whole lot of unrest. The Jews wanted to be running the place, and they weren't being allowed to do it. And we even read in the Gospels about Barabbas. Barabbas had committed murder in the insurrection. They were always causing trouble. And eventually they were causing so much trouble that the Romans decided to get rid of them once and for all. And that's what led to the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And the Romans were determined not to let them continue on in the place apart from a few stragglers, and they changed the name to Palestine. And where did they get that name from? They got it from the Philistines, who were the traditional enemies of Israel. Anyway, from that time on, the land was always under the control of a foreign power. I mean, the Romans were controlling it then, and then in Constantine's day, it was still Rome, but then it had a degree of Christian control. But that was lost in the 6th or 7th century to the Muslims under Muhammad. And they ruled it for a while, and then the Christianised Europe got it back a bit during the Crusades. But then at the end of the Crusades, the Turks took over, and the Turks were in control for about 800 years. Now, the Turks, of course, are Muslim by religion, but they're not Arabs, they're not Palestinians, they are the Turks. And they lost control in 1917, basically to Australia. One of the most famous battles in history was the liberation of Beersheba in 1917 by the Australian Light Horse. The last great cavalry charge of history. And of course that meant that the Australians were fighting on the side of the British. So the British then took over in 1917. and they controlled the place under what was called the British Mandate for the next 30 years. And it really wasn't until after the Second World War where the United Nations decided to give the land back to the Jews in 1947-48 that the land became known as Israel again. Well, the area was called Palestine, but the Jews, of course, have called it Israel, which understandably, when they've been given a homeland, they want it by their own name. But really, from a biblical point of view, that is the most amazing, I suppose, fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Because God had said that he was going to bring them back to their land in the latter days. And I mean, they were outcasts really for nearly 2,000 years. And yet, if we have a look at Isaiah 66, he says, ask the question, can a nation be born in a day? Well, yes, they can, and they were. Yeah. It really was an absolutely amazing fulfillment of prophecy. Now, obviously, they don't have the amount of land that they once had in antiquity, and they don't have as much, or they didn't have as much as the United Nations had actually allocated to them, because there was a war in 47-48, and at the end of that war, Jordan was in control of the area that we call the West Bank, and Egypt was in control of the area that we call Gaza. Now, in the 1967 war, that's when Israel got back control of both of those areas, the West Bank area and the Gaza Strip area, which they then vacated about 15 years ago and gave it back to the Palestinians, and they probably regret that now. But that's really what happened. And the people who live in the West Bank and Gaza now are predominantly Arabs, and they call themselves Palestinians because of the.
What about the Israelites? Are they the same Israelites, the same people group today as the original Israelites?
Yes and no. The Jews traditionally have intermarried very much with other Jews. But even in Jesus' day, we read about Timothy, whose grandmother and mother were Jewish, but his father was a Greek. And I know personally I've got a great-great-grandparent who was Jewish. So it's not been quite as tight an intermarriage, and the Jews have been dispersed all over the world. So clearly there's a lot of other ethnicity has got into the Jewish people, but certainly you'd have to say the majority would be what we would call the continuation of that Israelite lineage.
Wow.
But anyway, look, that's a fairly simplified history of that part of the Middle East. And I think Christians who are students of Bible prophecy ought to see it as an amazing fulfillment of prophecy before their very eyes, because it never looked like they would ever get back that land and be in control of it. But now they are. And I think it was so unexpected that we need to see that that's the beginning of maybe the latter days, and the rise of antagonism towards Israel and the Jewish people that we're seeing at the moment. That looks to be further fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And I would encourage all our listeners to read Psalm 83, because Psalm 83, even though it was written by Asaph 3,000 years ago, it could have been written yesterday. I mean, it is so accurate about what is going on in the area now. And other Old Testament books, particularly Ezekiel in chapter 38, speak of a time when all the nations are going to be coming against Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the way things are happening, that could be just around the corner.
You can see how nations are sort of turning their heads even today. I mean, yes, absolutely.
And I mean, that means the return of Jesus could be very, very close. But look, the other thing that we don't hear much mention of, but we really need to look at it, is the spiritual aspect of that conflict. Mm-hmm. Because God told the ancient Israelites through Moses that if they were obedient to his laws, they'd be a blessed people. Mm-hmm. But if they were disobedient, then disasters would happen to them. And of course, we know that they were disobedient. And we read about the time of the judges where they got to be disobedient, and then they started to repent, and God raised up a judge to deliver them from their enemies at the time, and they got back to being obedient to the law, and then it all happened all over again, mm-hmm. you know. And then they were being constantly, and God was using their enemies to harass them because their enemies were motivated by the forces of darkness. Mm. I mean, they were constantly harassed by the Philistines, and then in the time of David, they had the land had peace, but then they were conquered by all the other ethnic groups. But what God didn't do is he didn't explain the spirit behind all of those disasters that were occurring to them. Mm-hmm. And Satan and his demons are eternal spirits. They're at enmity with God and against especially the Jews, who were God's chosen people. And God has allowed those spirits to motivate their enemies to attack them and deliver them punishment for failure to obey his laws. And those evil forces are still at work in our day, and they're motivating many people throughout the world to oppose Israel. Mm. And what they don't realise, of course, is the source of their motivation. And ultimately, it's really in the purposes of God, because His word is going to be fulfilled. You know, that war in Ezekiel 38 is going to occur, and all the nations are going to be gathered together against Israel, and ultimately God will intervene, and they will recognise Jesus as their Messiah. So, I mean, we are seeing prophecy fulfilled right before our very eyes.
Yeah,
you know, and we need to recognise as Christians that tough times are ahead. Maybe the worst time of trouble in history, and we need to be very aware of what Jesus said to the churches in the book of Revelation, particularly the last two churches, Sardis and Laodicea, where the church people, the Christian people, were getting to be very, very lukewarm. And, it's very interesting to me that the word Laodicea actually means judgment of the people. Laos is people, Dicea is judgment of the people. And maybe that's what we're looking at just around the corner because of our slackness. Who knows? Very, very interesting times ahead, Mick.
Absolutely. Well, that was a very interesting little history lesson about Israel too. Wow, hasn't, I won't say the ownership, but the control of that area changed so many times.
Oh, yeah, it really is amazing. And I'm pretty confident that the Jewish people are not going to give up control now. You know, the fight is going to be on in earnest, I think, for the rest of history.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. John. Another awesome week. And we don't have you next week. We've got someone else.
Is that right?
I think so. We don't have you twice in a row. That's what I saw on my list. Today is the 6th, and next week we've got you. Yeah, there we go. So
yeah, I thought I was here next week.
There you go. So we have got you again next week, and we're looking forward to it already.
And me too, Mick.
Thank you, Dr. John. That was an awesome week. It is 10 minutes to 5. You're on 94.9, and coming up next, we've got CC Winans with Believe For It.